Patricia's shoulders slumped as she finally sank into the chair furthest from the group. "Fine," she muttered, "but I'm documenting everything." What followed was perhaps the strangest hunting club meeting in Coastal Pines history. As hours passed, the conversation shifted from awkward silence to cautious interaction. When Patricia discovered that Dominic was a retired environmental lawyer, their heated debate about conservation versus hunting rights occupied a full hour. When she learned that Hank's daughter attended the same elite university as her niece, another wall came down. By 3 a.m., Patricia was nursing a cup of hot tea while reluctantly admitting that Frank's venison stew was not entirely terrible. "So you're telling me," she said skeptically, "that your hunting club actually donates meat to the local food pantry?" £400 last season, Pete confirmed. "Plus we sponsor the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center's annual fundraiser." Patricia frowned into her tea. "That's not what I expected." Frank smiled slightly. "People rarely are." As the storm raged outside, something unexpected happened inside the shelter. Understanding began to take root. Dawn broke with eerie silence. The satellite feed showed Hurricane Eliza finally moving inland, weakened but still dangerous. When the all clear came through, Frank led the group up the main stairs to survey the damage. The scene that greeted them left everyone speechless. The lush, manicured Coastal Pines neighborhood was transformed. Trees uprooted, power lines down, streets flooded, and debris scattered everywhere. Frank's house, with its hurricane shutters and reinforced roof, stood relatively intact save for some damaged siding. 3 houses down, Patricia's colonial-style home had fared much worse. The unsecured bay windows had shattered, allowing rain to soak everything inside. Half her roof was stripped of shingles, and her prized ornamental cherry tree lay across her driveway. Patricia stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. The men exchanged glances. Without a word, Bill and Marcus headed toward their trucks to retrieve chainsaws and tools. Pete and Dominic began clearing smaller debris from the street. "Insurance won't be out for days," Frank said quietly, standing beside Patricia. "The guest room is yours for as long as you need it." Patricia turned to him, confusion evident in her reddened eyes. "Why would you help me? After everything?" Frank shrugged. "That's what neighbors do. Even neighbors who report your fence height." Her attempt at humor was weak but genuine. "Especially those neighbors." Frank handed her a pair of work gloves. "Besides, now you owe me one." By sunset, Patricia's driveway was clear, her windows temporarily secured with Frank's spare plywood, and her salvageable belongings moved to dry ground. The neighborhood had come together, with even those who'd previously avoided Patricia's rigid HOA enforcement joining the effort. 6 months later, Coastal Pines held its annual community preparedness meeting. Attendance was at a record high, with Patricia Calloway herself giving a presentation on household hurricane readiness. "And remember," she concluded, making eye contact with Frank in the back row, "sometimes the most important survival tool isn't in your emergency kit, it's your relationship with your neighbors." As people mingled afterward, Patricia approached Frank with a folder. "What's this?" he asked, opening it to find official HOA documentation. "Approval for your shelter expansion," she replied with a small smile. The committee voted unanimously. "We're recommending every street have at least one community access shelter before next hurricane season." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Community access?" "Don't worry," Patricia said, a hint of her old sharpness returning. "I'm not planning to crash any more of your hunting club meetings, but perhaps we could schedule them around the new Neighborhood Watch program." From across the room, Frank's hunting club friends watched in amazement as the 2 former adversaries laughed together. "Never thought I'd see the day," Hank muttered. Bill shook his head. "Sometimes it takes a storm to show people who they really are." The space below was nothing like the crude shelter they had expected the first time Frank had invited them down. This was more like an underground cabin. Wood-paneled walls decorated with hunting trophies, comfortable leather seating, a fully stocked kitchenette, satellite television, gun cases secured to the wall, and even a small bathroom. "Sweet setup," Dominic whistled, admiring the 65-inch television where the weather radar showed Hurricane Eliza's massive eye wall approaching their county. Above them, something crashed against Frank's house with enough force to make dust drift from the ceiling. The men glanced up, but continued unpacking their supplies. $10, says Patricia's house loses its roof first, Bill joked, cracking open beers for everyone. Not funny, Frank replied, though he couldn't help but smile. She didn't even board her windows, said it would damage the aesthetic of the neighborhood. They settled in, the howling wind now just a distant backdrop to their conversation about the upcoming hunting season. The first hour passed comfortably as the storm intensified above them. None of them noticed the emergency exit light begin to flash. A screeching alarm cut through their conversation, followed by the pneumatic hiss of the emergency entrance. A secondary access point disguised as a storm drain at the edge of Frank's property. The system was designed to allow entrance during emergencies, key to respond to sustained pressure that wouldn't occur accidentally. What the hell? Hank jumped to his feet, nearly knocking over the table. The reinforced door burst open with a bang that echoed through the shelter. Wind and rain howled through the opening for a brief moment before a figure tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Soaking wet and gasping for breath stood Patricia Calloway, her perfectly highlighted hair plastered to her head, designer clothes clinging to her frame, and her white-knuckled hands clutching what appeared to be a Louis Vuitton handbag wrapped in plastic. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was water dripping from Patricia's clothes onto the concrete floor and the muted howl of the hurricane outside. Then Patricia's eyes widened as she took in the 6 men staring back at her. Her gaze darted from the mounted deer head to the gun cases, then to the hunting knives on display, before finally settling on Frank. "You!" she shrieked, backing against the door. "I knew it! Secret underground meetings. Is this some kind of militia? A cult? I'm reporting all of this." She frantically dug through her handbag for her phone, fingers trembling. Frank exchanged glances with his friends, torn between amusement and concern. "Ma'am, there's a Category 4 hurricane above us. I don't think emergency services are taking HOA complaints right now. This is illegal." Patricia waved her phone around, desperately searching for signal. "A private bunker. Weapons. This violates at least 17 regulations." Dominic, always the peacemaker, stepped forward with a towel and a bottle of water. "Actually, ma'am, this is the Coastal Pines Hunting Club's monthly meeting," he said gently. "Special hurricane edition, and you're soaking wet. Would you like to sit down?" Patricia's look of disgust could have curdled milk. "I would rather stand in the hurricane." 3 hours later, the atmosphere inside the shelter was more tense than the barometric pressure outside. Patricia had reluctantly accepted a towel, but refused food, water, or seating, choosing instead to stand with her back against the wall, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "The signal's not coming back until the storm passes," Frank explained for the 3rd time. "But we have a satellite phone for emergencies." "This is an emergency," Patricia snapped. "I'm trapped underground with 6 men I barely know, who are clearly planning something illegal." Bill, normally the most patient of the group, finally set down his beer. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we're planning a deer hunting trip. Legal, licensed, and about as exciting as watching paint dry to anyone not interested in hunting." "Then why the secrecy? Why the underground lair?" Patricia demanded. "It's a stone shelter that doubles as a man cave," Hank explained. "And the only secret is how Frank convinced his wife to let him spend this much money on it." A particularly violent gust rattled the shelter's ventilation system, momentarily silencing everyone. "My house," Patricia whispered, her composure cracking for the first time. "I didn't have time to secure everything. The new bay windows." Frank felt a twinge of sympathy despite himself. "That's why we offered you a seat. It's going to be a long night." The satellite phone buzzed with an incoming county emergency alert, breaking the tension. Frank read it aloud. "Eliza has stalled offshore. Sustained winds expected for next 12 to 14 hours. Remain in shelter." The deer head mounted above Frank Delaney's fireplace seemed to stare directly at Patricia Calloway as she stood on his porch, clipboard in hand. lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval. Your fence is exactly 4 inches higher than HOA regulations permit, Mr. Delaney, she announced without even a greeting. And that contraption in your backyard needs to be removed immediately. That contraption was the reinforced entrance to Frank's pride and joy, a $75,000 underground storm shelter he designed himself after Hurricane Julian had nearly taken his roof 5 years earlier. At 52, Frank had weathered more Gulf Coast storms than he could count, and he'd built this shelter to withstand anything nature could throw at them. What he hadn't counted on was the hurricane named Patricia, who had moved into the subdivision 3 months ago. That shelter saved 3 families during the last evacuation, Frank replied calmly, scratching his hunting dog Duke behind the ears. It's county approved and grandfathered into the HOA bylaws. Patricia's nostrils flared. We'll see about that. And control that animal. He barked for 17 minutes yesterday while I was on an important call. As she marched away, Frank's phone buzzed with a weather alert. Hurricane Eliza had changed course overnight. Category 4, direct hit expected within 24 hours. Duke whined softly at Frank's feet. I know, boy, Frank muttered, watching Patricia's retreating form. She's going to be trouble during this storm. Frank had no idea just how right he would be. Back inside, Frank pulled up the latest radar images on his tablet. The swirling mass of Eliza dominated the screen, her counterclockwise arms reaching toward the coastline like a malevolent creature from the deep. Frank had seen enough hurricanes to know this one meant business. Alice, he called out to his wife. Better call Sarah and see if that guest room offer still stands. Alice appeared in the doorway, already folding laundry into a small suitcase. After 30 years of marriage, she knew the drill. Already texted her. She's expecting me by 4. You sure you don't want to come? Frank shook his head. Someone needs to watch the house. Besides, the boys are coming over for the meeting. We've been planning this trip for months. Your hunting club is more important than a Category 4 hurricane. Alice raised an eyebrow, but her tone was light. She'd long ago accepted Frank's devotion to his monthly gatherings. The shelter was built for exactly this scenario, Frank replied, pulling up the group chat to confirm everyone was still coming. Despite the approaching storm, all 5 had recommitted to attending. These weren't city folk who panicked at the first drop of rain. These were men who'd grown up in hurricane country, who knew how to respect nature's fury while not letting it dictate their lives. The television switched to an emergency broadcast, showing the local meteorologist standing on the beach. Wind whipped his raincoat as he gestured to the darkening sky behind him. Residents of coastal pines and surrounding areas are strongly advised to evacuate or seek approved shelter immediately, he shouted over the wind. Hurricane Eliza has intensified to a strong Category 4 with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour. Storm surge expected to reach. The broadcast cut to footage of highways clogged with evacuating vehicles, gas stations with lines stretching for blocks, and hardware stores with empty shelves where plywood and generators had been. Frank's phone pinged with a text from Bill. Still good for 6. Bringing that venison jerky you like. As Frank typed his reply, he noticed movement through the front window. Patricia was across the street, taking photos of the Johnson family's Halloween decorations they hadn't yet taken down. Even with a hurricane bearing down, she was documenting violations. Frank's phone rang, the special ringtone he'd assigned to the HOA board president, Jim Sullivan. Frank, glad I caught you. Jim's voice sounded tired. Patricia's filed another complaint about your shelter entrance. Says it's an eyesore and a safety hazard. Frank pinched the bridge of his nose. With all due respect, Jim, there's a Category 4 hurricane about to make landfall. Maybe we could table this discussion. That's why I'm calling, Jim replied. The board voted unanimously to designate your shelter as a community resource during this emergency. We've had requests from elderly residents who can't evacuate. Patricia was the only dissenting vote. Frank watched through the window as Patricia marched back to her house, phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating wildly at something in her yard. How many people are we talking about? Frank asked, already mentally rearranging the shelter to accommodate extra guests. That's just it, Jim said. Everyone's either evacuated or has family to stay with. Except. Frank already knew what was coming. Except Patricia. She refused evacuation, Jim confirmed. Said she has important work that requires her to stay. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. The same woman who'd fought against his shelter might soon need it the most. I'll keep an eye out for her, Frank promised, though the thought of sharing his sanctuary with Patricia Calloway was about as appealing as sharing it with the hurricane itself. You're still having your hunting club meeting. During a hurricane, Alice packed her overnight bag while giving her husband an incredulous look. Frank Delaney, sometimes I wonder about your priorities. Lightning flashed outside their bedroom window, followed by a crack of thunder that made the windows rattle. Hurricane Eliza was announcing her arrival hours ahead of schedule. The shelter was built for this, honey, Frank replied, helping her with her suitcase. The guys are already on their way. Besides, you'll be safe at your sister's, and we've got enough supplies for a week down there. What Frank didn't mention was that Patricia Calloway had spent the morning taking photos of his property and arguing with the city inspector who'd stopped by to check on storm preparations. The thought of spending a few hours underground with his closest friends, away from his neighbor's prying eyes, was more appealing than ever. By 6, the wind had transformed from concerning to dangerous. Tree branches whipped against windows, and the emergency alert system blared warnings from every phone and television. Frank's sheltered entrance hummed with activity as his friends arrived in quick succession, each bringing their contributions. Bill with his famous venison jerky, Marcus with craft beers, Hank carrying a satellite radio, Pete with emergency supplies, and Dominic, the newest member, nervously clutching maps for their upcoming hunting trip. Gentlemen, Frank announced as they descended the reinforced concrete stairs, welcome to the Apocalypse Bunker.